So, what happens with the Williams? Getting better. Yeah. Talking about new waters. Maybe I use I don't know if you can even get them inside out. Unfortunately, there's a lot of competition for this. You know, I live just close to great question. And how do we get to your understanding? Jason. Yeah. That's how I'm next. So coming business. Yeah. Good morning and welcome to Sunday's Forum.
Good morning.
We're very glad you're here, whether in the chapel here or online. And we're very pleased to see you. My name is Jackie Prince and I'm a member of the Sunday Forum Committee. Before introducing our speaker, I have a few housekeeping announcements. If those of you online have questions for the professor, you can type them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen at any time, and we'll answer them in the question period. If you have technical issues, you can reach Alex Johnson, our tech expert, by using the chat function. And many thanks, as always, to Alex for helping us through these sessions. Our speaker's name is so uniformly named by non-Ukrainian speakers that he's asked that we simply call him Paul. So I will let him tell us his last name himself. But Dr. Paul is the Aquinas Chair in Theology and Philosophy at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul. He was born in Kyiv and came to the US in 1993. His elderly parents, who fled from Kyiv in 2022, are now refugees in Lithuania. The professor is the founder and president of Rebuild Ukraine, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to providing aid for the people of Ukraine. Since March of this year, Rebuild Ukraine has raised more than $500,000 and has delivered food, medical supplies, and protective gear to Ukraine's hospitals and military units. They've also founded the education and rejuvenation of children traumatized by the war. Please help me welcome Dr. Paul.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for coming to this forum. It's a privilege and a wonderful opportunity to speak to you today. Let me share the screen so that those of us who are online are also able to watch us. Alex, are we in business? Wonderful, wonderful. As Jackie mentioned, I certainly have a skin in the game, as they say, because since February 24th, 2022, I know that my life will never really be the same. The war started for me when a friend positioned in London alerted me with this very simple text: "It is happening." We were expecting, of course, that there will be a form of Russian invasion on Ukraine. Nobody exactly could predict as to what shape it would take. I got on the phone with my brother. It was 4 o'clock in the morning in Lithuania, and 200 phone calls and other things later, we were able to evacuate our parents and my brother's parents-in-law from the south of Kyiv, first to the outskirts of the city, and then 6 days and 6 countries later, they arrived to Lithuania. And so a trip that would typically take about a very pleasant hour-and-a-half flight on a low cost from Kyiv to Kaunas took, in this case, 6 days. And that particular tire represents to me presently, I think, the long suffering of the Ukrainian people, civilians, and also military as a result of the war. My parents managed to lose 2 tires in the span of about 150 miles, and somehow the help just arrived. And this was the moment when my brother and I realized that we had a nimble and resilient network of young professionals on which we could rely in actually doing a lot more. And so this is my parents being hosted by wonderful volunteers in Romania. So Romania was simply one of the countries that they passed through. And this is a lovely country cottage in which they were hosted. Now, my own parents are now perfectly fine and live fairly comfortable lives in Lithuania. Here you see them actually weaving that pretty enormous camouflage net. So this is a net that you would put on a large bunker in a forest or on a tank, actually, to safeguard the tank from a potential attack. Mind you, of course, this isn't just their doing. This required a cooperation of some marvelous Lithuanian women. And this is my great aunt, and this is accurate. She is, in fact, 98. I was in Lithuania, so we also had to evacuate her. And she arrived all in one piece, I'm ready to say. I mean, I'm happy to say. And so here she's also doing her part in contributing to the weaving process here and making ribbons for camouflage gear. When I was there about 3 weeks ago now, I prophesied that my great aunt will live until the age of 150. My father didn't particularly like the idea. So What I would like to do in this presentation is to give you a sense of the broader context of this war, and then specifically focus on what Rebuild Ukraine is doing, both in the country and for the refugees. I also very much hope
Recording in progress.
marvelous. Thank you. Whatever you did, thank you. So as I mentioned already, the Russian army attacked on February the 24th. The invasion itself was completely unprovoked and unjustified. Putin expected a very quick victory because he thought that Ukrainians were going to be meeting the Russian army with flowers. And when that did not happen, he proceeded, of course, to terrorize the peaceful population, and in fact is presently also implicated in the destruction of the civilian infrastructure, especially as I speak, destroying power grids with very inexpensive Iranian drones, which, by the way, are also a knockoff of our drones. So it's an interesting circle in this situation. So the war is very likely to last for months, and at least its hot phase will be lasting for the next till winter really begins in earnest. And then its colder phase might very well drag for years unless there is a regime change in Russia. And I would put presently the probability of a regime change in Russia at about 30%. And that's primarily based on social media intelligence that we have, the kind of the capacity that we have. One of the particularly concerning elements, of course, is the killing of civilians. And we presently know that already close to 500 children died. This is not just children affected, that's thousands, but actually 500 died as a result of this war. So some of you might have seen this particular footage on CNN. So this is a drama theater in the southern city of Mariupol. This was in March of this year. This drama theater was used as a shelter. And what you see in those two white squares are signs prominently displaying in Russian so that the Russian bombers can see. And the bombers typically fly relatively low, so this would have been visible to them. And so the signs say children in both cases. So that did not deter, unfortunately, the Russian invaders. This is how this theater looked before the Russian attack. And as you can see, the shambles of the theater as a result of the bombing. We know today that more than 600 civilians died in that attack alone. So obviously we are dealing here with a situation where Ukraine needs an air shield. It's something, I mean, I was on the streets, lots of us were, of course, demanding some form of air protection already in February in front of the Capitol building. I am glad to say that at least our governor was very, very attentive to that particular message. And obviously what needed to happen was the kind of joint protest of various people or at least what we tried to bring to the attention of our local government needed subsequently to be brought to the attention of the federal government. And the federal government, of course, is notoriously slow, but at least presently now they are responding with considerable amount of determination. So in that regard, I think that the joint NATO help presently is significant. What's problematic is that it's arriving very, very slowly. So it seems to be arriving constantly with a significant amount of delay. President Zelensky, from a comedian and more or less simply a successful small businessman, and for all practical purposes, politically speaking, nobody, has really become a kind of a national hero and really arguably an international hero. This is a man who famously said, when we were offering him protection, his family protection and help, he famously said, "I do not need a ride, I need weapons." And so obviously that, I think, that fundamental message was heard. And I think the fact that he stayed in the capital with his people was quite significant. Of course, he himself is a living refutation of Moscow's claim that somehow Ukraine is full of radicals and Nazis and whatnot. He himself is a Russian-speaking Jew. So I want us to ponder this point for a second. Ukraine presently is the only country in the in Europe, and the only country apart from Israel that actually has a Jew for its president. It elected Zelensky in a landslide of 73% voting for Zelensky. Zelensky himself had actually to take Ukrainian language lessons in order for him to actually master it. I would not be surprised if he still speaks Russian in the family. And that's a completely normal thing. I mean, I grew up as a Russian-speaking Ukrainian. My Russian is slightly better than my Ukrainian. It's a bilingual country. And so the question of language is a non-issue. We do have, of course, in the case of Kremlin's propaganda, what Timothy Snyder referred to as a kind of a schizofascism, meaning you basically have a regime that is intent on genocidal practices, and in that regard resembles fascists, that is calling the other side fascists, was the hope, I suppose, of simply rendering the notion of fascism vacuous. So the world's response was a more united NATO. Certainly intelligence, joint NATO intelligence in support of Ukraine has been quite significant and effective. And obviously, most recently, significant military aid is helping, but I already noted the fact that it's helping somewhat slowly. And massive, so at the government level, certainly massive aid for refugees was also not insignificant, especially at the early stages of the conflict. So I wanted now to talk about the kind of task of NGOs and specifically talk about Rebuild Ukraine. Why did we start the organization, and also what sort of help do we provide? So the reason I started Rebuild Ukraine, I guess one reason was that I'm a very impatient man. And I saw large NGOs doing great work, but for my money, doing it slowly, meaning that, I saw them delivering on the promise 2 months, 3 months, several months into the conflict. And we wanted to act swiftly. And that is one of the reasons we've created a nonprofit. I have some experience in the nonprofit work. I run a large international academic nonprofit with a membership of thousands, but that's actually relatively easy compared to these war relief efforts. So how do we work? Early on, we sort of looked at the financial situation and at the kind of cost assessment, and we decided that we would not be sourcing products from the United States, primarily because it was just not cost effective. So we source most of our products in the European Union, specifically in Lithuania, meaning medical supplies and also protective gear. And then we deliver it through Poland into Ukraine, and that typically takes us less than a week. So from acquisition to the delivery to our distribution center in Western Ukraine, that's less than a week. And then what we have is the capacity to deliver the goods to 60 military locations. Very often we're able to deliver to the front lines. And when I say the front lines, I actually mean the front lines. I don't mean, you know, the mile right before the front lines. I actually mean the front lines. And why can we do this? Because of extensive contacts in the military community. So that's the reason that's possible. So we have a network of grand total of 100 volunteers. Everybody in the United States, including yours truly, is a volunteer. So we have about 30 volunteers in the United States, and they are just fabulous people because you don't necessarily need the quantity, you just need the quality. You really need people in the right place, if you will. And so this event, for example, was put together, of course, by your wonderful church and committee, and also by Cheryl Brown, that organizes events for us and has just extensive experience in development work. And it's just a testament to how organized we are and how well we do what we can. So we have a board of directors that consists of university administrators and professors, and also prominent business people. And in the first 8 months of the war, we've been blessed to raise over $500,000, as was mentioned. And so all of that money is already put to work. And the reason it's put to work is because our administrative costs and even our staff costs in Ukraine are negligible. I mentioned a few nights ago that they're under 5%. It's actually less than that. We have the capacity. So, for example, I'll talk about our emergency vehicles program in a moment, but with something like emergency vehicles, if I raise 5,000 in the United States, I'm more or less guaranteed that people will crowdsource and would double that amount in Ukraine. Why? Because they're needed, because the vehicles are needed, because the war demon destroys them very, very quickly. And so these things is absolutely needed. So what we have is a nimble and reliable and transparent structure. We have an established network of professionals within Ukraine. How did this come about? Well, my brother's company, Semantic Force, for 8 years has now been in support of orphanages. He was just doing it without really creating any structure. It was simply something that he did as the humanitarian efforts of his own IT company. And so because of that network, we already have people that were plugged into nonprofit work and really liked it, really loved it. So we approach our nonprofit work as one would approach a small business, meaning that at the end, of course, is not profit, but at the end is life saved. And what that specifically means is that we're trying to invest in the products that have the highest probability of actually saving life, especially at this present moment, at the sort of hot stage of the war. We have first-class social media intelligence. My brother runs the largest social media intelligence company in the world. Let me give you an illustration of what that means. Largest company in Eastern Europe, not in the world, but in Eastern Europe. Let me illustrate what that means. Let's just say we hear about fires in Russia happening as a result of a draft. And what comes through to the main channels of information would be 3 main fires in various areas, especially in the areas where they collect or draft soldiers, very often against their will. Well, what we're able to see is not 3 or 5 major fires, but 246 of them all over Russia. So it's that type of intelligence that we gather. And of course, it also proves to be very useful in the war relief efforts. And so the result is essentially we know our end users very well. We have constant touch. We're constantly in touch with our end users. And we also know that our help, in fact, is doing its work. And the way that happens is that we require verification. So what type of help is needed, especially right now? So we presently, while there's still a war, because Ukrainians still want to have a country to return to, presently it would actually be foolish to engage in any major reconstruction project other than emergency projects. In fact, the government itself explicitly bans, for example, the reconstruction of the hospitals or schools. Again, the reason for that is because there's no it's possible that those would be destroyed by Russian drones in a week. And so what is being, of course, reconstructed are power grids, bridges when you need to reconstruct them, things like that. And of course, you also blow up bridges where you need to blow them up. So the work of reconstruction proper will start after the war. So what are we then presently engaged in? We are rebuilding Ukraine, but we're primarily rebuilding Ukraine by investing in its defenders. Our signature item is a pretty straightforward and simple thing, and it is something called a tourniquet. And so what a tourniquet does, it essentially, when a soldier is wounded, and especially if it's a gushing wound, what it does, it cuts off bleeding internally. And that gives you about 2 or 3 hours. And during those 2 or 3 hours, you essentially need to drive a person from the field of battle to a medical center, a medical facility. If it's a more serious matter, then after that, a military clinic, a person would need to be driven to the hospital. I saw those boys and girls. I saw especially difficult cases when I volunteered at a military hospital in the capital, in Kyiv, in 2015. So I sort of speak about these things from personal experience. They can be highly effective if they are applied properly. The Army is actually now trained with our tourniquets. So in fact, on one of the banners that we use, we actually have specifically the military being trained how to apply the tourniquets. So we've supplied over 8,000 of them, and we know that we've saved hundreds of lives. How do we know this? So this is just one example of a delivery to our distribution center in Ukraine. It's about 2,500 of them actually in this particular case. What you see, by the way, what you see on top, and I'm not going to talk too much about this, are actually solar panels. So one of the things that are absolutely needed when the soldiers are stationed in the woods or in the fields is a relatively small power energy supply, electricity supply, and that's to power up essential electronics. I mean, we all have to power up our cell phones once every, a couple of days. And the same applies specifically to electronics that do navigation, that do other types of things. So what do they typically do? Well, they have to leave the forest, so they have to leave the field and go to an adjacent village. That makes them a target for the reconnaissance drones, and that also makes the villagers a target for a potential attack. So it actually, and we have lost people as a result of that. So what are then the solar panels doing? These solar panels, they're relatively small and portable. They power up an energy bank, and then from that energy bank, you are then able to recharge essential electronics. So again, we are investing in something that's saving lives. This is a case of a Russian attack on a city in central Ukraine, and the tragic thing is more than 100 people were wounded. 20 of them needed the application of tourniquets. Not everybody needs the application of a tourniquet, but those who need, 20 of them used our tourniquets, and everybody survived. Okay, so that's the reason, I guess, why I do what I do instead of writing books and other marvelous things, is because every week I get the news that in some tangible manner, what we're trying to do has in fact influenced and saved human lives. And so you can think of this theologically as simply participating in God's mission of giving us life and giving it more abundantly. And in this case, of course, It just means that people will live. What else have we supplied? So in the beginning of the war, this was especially a particularly serious matter, and that is you had the dearth of medications. Imagine you're going to your favorite pharmacy to restock on, let's just say, hypertension drug, and you discover that your favorite pharmacy has been blown out. Okay, you say, there's another pharmacy within a mile, so you walk there or you drive there, and you discover that that pharmacy is out of the drug because of the disruption of supply routes. So what we've been able to do is, in Lithuania specifically, we had a deal with the central pharmacy that was actually at some point was able to supply us with prescription medications. Presently, that doesn't seem to be an issue, although I expect that with the disruption of the power grids, the whole issue of, for example, conserving medications and things like that would again become a problem. So for most of the last several months, we've been supplying over-the-counter medications, but that might change depending on the situation. So in addition to the tourniquet, and you can think of the individual first aid kit, or simply first aid kit, as a kind of a tourniquet on steroids, because it's actually an American highest military grade tourniquet that is in that, and then lots of other goodies. And the goodies basically are primarily hemostatic bandages and other types of medical supplies that a military medic, trained military medic, would need when there is a situation when the soldiers need first aid. I'm also told that the first aid kits are also something that you can, in fact, train soldiers in. So we've been supplying those by the dozens. We would very much like to supply those by the hundreds. And why? Because Ukraine presently has an army of 700,000. And so, yes, at the level of the government, that could be solved partially, but we know for a fact that the need is very, very, very huge. And so this is our latest delivery of 28 boxes of all kinds of interesting things, including the first aid kits. And here, for example, is this aid at our distribution center just last week. And so you could see all kinds of things, military backpacks, for example. We've also discovered that providing the soldiers with one single-use or double-use tents was actually a big deal. And the reason for that, I do have a picture. So on this picture, what you see is this larger tent. And so that tent holds about 10 to 15 soldiers, depending on the situation. And so it makes perfect economic sense for Russians to bomb something like that, because destroying a tent with a unit of 10 or 15 people, that's a high impact enterprise. It makes no sense to even use, interestingly, a drone to destroy a single use or double use tent. So you provide, what you do then is you dissipate a military unit that's stationed in the forests and the fields by providing them with single or double use tents. They often use double use tents for medications of food, so to store medications of food, and you save lives. Again, we have data to back up the fact that we have, as a result of that, saved lives. And what sort of data? Well, Russians did bomb the tent that presumably had to have 15 people, and those people were not there because they were in the individual tents. So again, all kinds of other things that I would not belabor. Many of you might have heard about Bucha and Russian atrocities there and the war crimes, attested war crimes. There is now, of course, a more sustained investigation of those war crimes. And in some fashion, Rebuild Ukraine will be helping the Clooney Foundation in fact, working on the data collection for these crimes. What people do not know is that, of course, that Bucha itself had to be liberated. And so our boots, our camouflage gear, our backpacks, all of that good stuff, in fact, was on the soldiers of Bucha. So that's another reason why I do what I do, is because we supply those who put their lives on the line on a daily basis. We also have supplied 10 emergency vehicles. These are typically used SUVs. So, of course, the reason we supply them used is because you never know for how long this vehicle would be serving, and you end up therefore supplying a significant number of them for the same amount of money. I'm especially proud of this ambulance because we bought it at an auction in Rome. And, you know, if an ambulance has actually been working on the streets of Rome, then it can basically work anywhere, as you can imagine. You would attest to that. And so I still actually have Roman feet. I was 3 weeks ago at a conference in Rome, actually, incidentally, on Ukraine. And yeah, it's as you know, it's a tough environment to operate in, but I love Rome. So we got this wonderful ambulance. Obviously, nobody wants it at an auction for $10,000. It probably has about $100,000 worth of all, you know, medical goodies still packed into it, which I especially delight in. And it's already working. It's already working and helping. Ambulances cannot quite get to the front line because for that you actually need ATVs. And so from the beginning of the war, this phase of the war, Ukrainians have figured out how to manufacture their own ATVs, because I was trying to get Polaris ATVs. And by the way, if anybody has Polaris connections, I'm still kind of hoping that maybe a snowmobile or ATV might come out of them. But it's just that then I will have to spend my life with the Department of State of actually getting military adjacent ATVs. And so, and I don't have a second life for that. But what we will be doing, we will be providing 3 ATVs for the price 5 times less than what Polaris is offering. Obviously, they're not going to be as great, okay? But, you know, I will go even with a very, very practical and reasonable option in this case, if in fact it's able to save lives. ATVs are helpful in a variety of settings, but they can, of course, bring the wounded out from the area that this particular ambulance would not be able to get to. There is also a sad and tragic element to what we do. Until the middle of July, we did not really lose anybody in our network, but the Ukrainian volunteer, Volodymyr Boroda, who was responsible for actually delivering this ambulance that I've just shown you, unfortunately was blown up as a result of the Russian attack upon the center of a peaceful city. And this was just a car park that was blown up. And that just also characterizes just the callousness and really sheer, there was no strategic purpose to destroying that particular area where you had a shopping center plus a car park. That's all you had. It is the case that about 200 yards from that place, an important summit was taking place, secret summit was taking place. But again, if you're going to bomb something successfully, at least do it right. And in this case, that didn't happen. But what did happen, unfortunately, was more than 20 people killed, including our volunteer. So why do we have tremendously efficient network of volunteers? Is because most of them, unfortunately, by now have a friend or a family member who either lost housing or is presently fighting or is already killed. Okay. So that's the reason why the people within the network are such that are really fully dedicated to what we're doing. So what are my dreams for the next 3 or 4 months, shall we say? I would love to see more first aid kits delivered, because we know that they're efficient, and more importantly, we know that the Army presently needs them. And so we have just received, a week ago, we received a disaster grant from Rotary International. Thank you, Rotaries, our local branch of Rotary International. And so we'd be able to supply 250 of them. If we have $75,000 extra, we will be able to supply 1,000 of them. So each pack is about $100 fully delivered, which is, again, very reasonable. The reason we're, in this case, sourcing it from the United States is not because of the sentimental value, it's because the Europeans looked at what we could provide and say, gosh, this has Israeli gauzes, and this has these wonderful bandages and a tourniquet that everybody really thinks is fantastic. Could you just deliver it then from the States? And that's what we're doing in this particular case, but only because it makes sense in terms of costs. I'd love to see more emergency vehicles. We also, this Monday, received $50,000 grant from a private family foundation in the Twin Cities. And so if we can double that, then there will be more vehicles. I'm told that we can actually do up to 10 vehicles for that grant of 50,000, which is kind of semi-miraculous, but essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to deplete the European Union of all their used SUVs. That's what's happening now. And because the war requires them. So finally, I want to talk about our programs having to do with children, because I think any war is a war on children. I had a wonderful and very protected childhood, and I would love to see those children to return to normalcy as quickly as possible. I certainly owe them at least that. So we have two major programs that I want to talk about. So the first one is in Montenegro. And what happened at the very beginning of the war, when close to 4.5 million people left the country within the span of about 3 or 4 weeks, you had about 50 families, 20 women, highly enterprising female professionals left Ukraine with their children. Now, why am I talking about just women? Well, because by law, the husbands, if they're under 60, had to stay in the country and help in the war relief effort. Not necessarily fight. You don't actually find, I mean, about, what is it, 3 to 5% of the population is engaged in active combat, but in a variety of other roles. So only women could leave. And that in itself is really difficult, but that's what happened here. So they come to Montenegro. These children, and I've talked to some of them, not in Montenegro, but in Lithuania, similar situation. These children have just been in the situation where they were hiding in the basements for a couple of weeks while there was, bombing and shelling and air raids, and was that reality. So they're fearful, they can barely speak, and the only thing that they have education-wise at that point is online learning. And of course, if COVID has taught us anything, it's that online learning for young children is not a very great idea. It's really not a great idea. So what these women have done, they've self-organized, they've essentially organized a teacher cooperative. And with a stipend of $5,000 a month, we've been able to support 20 refugee teachers and 100 children. So specifically, what is it that we supported them with? We are still renting classroom space and facilities, quite spacious and large, because prior to that, this might look blissful, but the only reason they are gathering on the shore of the sea, of the Adriatic, is because they didn't, at that point, they actually didn't have, at the beginning, they did not have the school facilities. So now we have a classroom space for them. We also provide school supplies, and for the first 3 months, we were also providing modest stipends for full-time teachers. And what is it that these kids were taught? There was arts therapy. This child is actually drawing the word Ukraine. And then there was also sand therapy, Ukrainian classes. There was a volunteer from the United States that taught them English. We had actually athletes from all over Europe coming and doing wonderful athletics classes, hiking, you name it. It was kind of a mini paradise was created for these children. And, kids are resilient. So in about 5 months, we've really seen some substantial results. So what are we doing now? We are still supporting that school, but they figured out how to actually pay the teachers. And what we're supplying, we're still enabling this enterprise by supplying them with primarily school space and school supplies, and funding a few special programs like the training of teachers. And that's the sort of thing that we would like to continue. We are replicating a similar program in Ukraine, within Ukraine, for internally displaced, because within the country you have several million people who have had to leave their place, especially in the south and in the east of the country. And so what we've done is summer camps, and now presently what we're doing is athletics camps, arts camps, and Ukrainian history camps in Kyiv, in the capital itself, and then in other major cities, basically wherever that help is needed. And that's again, and so this is in Kyiv about 2 weeks ago, actually. And so why is that needed? Well, because you constantly have air raids. These children only have access to online learning, which is really insufficient in these circumstances. And so we're providing, I'm an educator, but we're providing much more than education. This is significantly more than education. It really is a kind of a survival tool for a significant number of Ukraine's civilians. So presently, we're about 90% of what we're doing for the sake of Ukraine's defenders, and we're about 10% in children. After the war, I want to be 90% in children and maybe 10% in war veterans. And, you know, again, if we're providentially granted amounts on a much more significant scale, then we would certainly have the capacity for rebuilding a school or a hospital, physically rebuilding a school or a hospital, potentially even building a new university, so that you could also shape and rebuild the minds. Because as a young democracy, Ukraine would certainly need kind of help and support on that front. And so obviously lots of, I mean, the programs themselves could benefit from expansion. What we're presently providing through a network, we could easily triple that, quadruple that, and provide more. And so this leads me then to the question of how each of us could help. The easiest thing perhaps to do would be to become a Rebuild Ukraine ambassador. And what that involves is, if in any way you've been inspired by anything that was mentioned today, be it the tourniquets and medical supplies, be it the first aid kits, or perhaps the emergency vehicles, just simply share this with one or two friends. What would you share? There's probably going to be a link, for example, to this presentation. On our website, we've been featured 5 times on Channel 5. There's kind of in-depth reporting on what our people are actually doing on the ground in some of these reports. There's also some wonderful reporting on some of our supporters here in the Midwest. And so just simply a link to those materials would be great. If we could organize more fundraisers with clubs that you're a part of, or other type, maybe professional communities that are a part of, I would very much like to do this. So as an example, I'm just giving you a couple of examples. This is our volunteers at a Ukrainian Heritage Festival, and here are our volunteers, or rather, here is a River Falls Arts Gallery that actually organized a fundraiser and just dedicated the whole month of July. It's local artists who produced art on Ukrainian themes, and then were able to sell that art. And again, that was just wonderful, wonderful help. Specifically, this was specifically to help our children's programs. So as you can see, for as long as I am able, I will kind of continue doing these public events. But you certainly don't necessarily have to have me. You could have one of our ambassadors. We could also do this online. Or it could simply be a collection. So there's a variety of ways in which this could happen. I think, again, my last thought would be that ideally we would love to see the first aid kits programs and then emergency vehicles programs and children's programs developed and scaled. Because the need presently remains enormous and no one NGO would be able to satisfy that need. And so this is where we are. So the blue represents the funds raised, and then the yellow represents the amounts that we would still love to see. Obviously, I would encourage you to prayerfully consider a contribution to what we're doing. So I think with this said, I could probably end the lecture part, and it looks like we still have about a few minutes, maybe a few minutes for Q&A. We do not. Okay.
But I suspect that we've got all will be here for a few minutes if people want to ask you questions personally. But we will close the session now so that people can get to church with their lives. But thank you, Professor, for your